Hello, and welcome to ELA Plus, your free supplemental guide to the English language arts. I'm your host, Brian E. Denton. In today's video lesson, we're going to learn about the English sonnet, one of the most enduring and powerful forms of poetry. From its origins in the sunny Sicilian countryside, to its introduction into the English language, and right up until today, the sonnet has provided poetry readers with an abundance of reading pleasure. We'll get things started by taking a look at the history of the sonnet's development. Then we'll learn exactly what the sonnet is, that is, its formalistic requirements. We'll also discuss and analyze the two major formats of the English sonnet. With that, we'll have a full grasp of what the English sonnet is, and we'll be ready to answer some comprehension questions. Okay, let's get to it. The first thing to know about the sonnet is that it is not indigenous to the English language. In fact, it was first developed in the 13th century by a notary of the court of Emperor Frederick II. That notary's name was Giacomo da Lentini, and he wrote his poetry in literary Sicilian. Now, the Sicilian court quite enjoyed da Lentini's poetry, and they called it sonetto, meaning little song. The rules of the sonetto were set very early in its development. 14 lines with a narrow turning point of argument or wit somewhere near the middle of the poem. We'll get deeper into the format of the sonnet shortly, but for now, let's focus a little bit longer on its history. While da Lentini first developed the sonnet, the Italian most responsible for popularizing the form was the 14th century scholar and poet Francesco Petrarch. So influential is Petrarch in the development of the sonnet, in fact, that he gives his name to one of the acceptable forms of the English sonnet that we have today, as we'll see later in this video. The sonnet was first brought to England in English poetry through the work of Sir Thomas Wyatt, an English politician, ambassador, and lyric poet. Busy guy. Wyatt first encountered the sonnet during his travels in Italy, and most of his sonnets are translations of Petrarch. Another early developer of the English sonnet was Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey. While Howard mostly wrote in the Italian Petrarchan form of the sonnet, he did contribute to the development of a distinctly English format, which would later be immortalized in the works of William Shakespeare. By the way, Shakespeare sonnets, we're going to read all of them on this channel, so stay tuned and subscribe for that. At any rate, now that we've briefly covered the history of the sonnet leading up to Shakespeare, we can now discuss the two major formats of the English language sonnet. The two major forms of the English sonnet are 1. The Italian Petrarchan format, and 2. The Shakespearean format. Looking at these two formats closely, we find that they have a lot in common. They share many elements, but they also differ in a few distinct ways. Let's look first at their similarities. Both forms feature 14 lines written, generally speaking, in iambic pentameter. The 14-line length is easy enough to understand. After all, if you can count to 14, then you can count how many lines there are in a poem. You might not know what iambic pentameter is, though. Lucky for you, ELA Plus is here to help you out. Iambic pentameter is a term that we use to describe the measurement of a line of language. Here we're talking about poetry, so iambic pentameter measures a line of a poem. An iamb is a disyllabic foot or rhythmic unit of 2 syllables, one unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. A stressed syllable is the syllable where the emphasis of the word is located. Think of the word portray. Here you'll find that the first syllable, por, is unstressed, while the second syllable, tray, is stressed. It's portray, not portray. Now, the best way to remember what an iamb is to think about the sound that a heart makes as it beats. Da-dum, 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 portray. Okay, so an iamb is 2 syllables, an unstressed syllable, followed by a stressed syllable. What then is this pentameter business all about? Well, pentameter just means a 5-footed line. So if there are 5 iambs in a line, and an iamb is 2 syllables, then a line of iambic pentameter means that there will be 10 syllables. This means that a line of iambic pentameter, 5 feet of iambs, will feature a rhythm like 5 heartbeats. Da-dum, 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 da-dum. Now, there's something very interesting about the relationship between iambic pentameter and the English language. It is the meter closest to our speech. Wait, did you hear that? It is the meter closest to our speech. Da-dum, 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 da-dum. It is the meter closest to our speech. Yes, iambic pentameter is everywhere, not only in our common speech, but also in our poetry. In fact, it has been estimated that over 3/4 of English language poetry, from Chaucer to Frost, has been written in either rhymed or unrhymed iambic pentameter. So that's what the Petrarchan sonnet and the Shakespearean sonnet have in common. They're both 14 lines long, and generally speaking, they're written in iambic pentameter. Where the two forms differ are in their line breakdowns and their rhyme schemes. Let's take a closer look at both those forms. We'll start with the Italian or Petrarchan sonnet. The Petrarchan sonnet features 14 rhymed lines with an octave, a sestet, and a volta. An octave is 8 lines of poetry, and in a Petrarchan sonnet, the octave follows the following rhyme scheme: A, B, B, A, B, B, A. A sestet, on the other hand, is 6 lines of poetry, and there are 2 acceptable rhyme schemes for the sestet in a Petrarchan sonnet. Those 2 acceptable rhyme schemes are CDE, CDE, or CDC, DCD. Volta is an Italian word that means turn, and in a sonnet, a volta means a turn of argument or a line of thought within the poem. Now, the volta appears in different places in a sonnet depending on if you're writing a Shakespearean sonnet or a Petrarchan sonnet. In a Petrarchan sonnet, the volta is going to occur typically between the octave and the sestet. So, to summarize, the Petrarchan sonnet features 14 lines of poetry written in iambic pentameter, featuring an octave, 8 lines of poetry, and a sestet, 6 lines of poetry, with a volta between the octave and the sestet. And it will feature one of 2 rhyme schemes, either A, B, B, A, B, B, A, C, D, E, C, D, E, or A, B, B, A, B, B, A, C, D, C, D, C, D. Now let's talk about the Shakespearean sonnet. The Shakespearean sonnet also has 14 lines and a volta, but these 14 lines are divided differently and the volta appears in a different place as well. These line divisions in a Shakespearean sonnet are 3 quatrains and 1 concluding couplet. A quatrain is 4 lines of poetry, and a Shakespearean sonnet has 3 quatrains. So those 3 quatrains have a rhyme scheme like this: A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F. And then in a Shakespearean sonnet, we have a concluding couplet. A couplet is 2 lines of poetry, and a Shakespearean couplet concludes like a chess match, GG. The placement of the volta in a Shakespearean sonnet typically occurs between the final quatrain and this concluding couplet. To sum up the Shakespearean sonnet then, we have 14 lines of rhymed iambic pentameter featuring 3 quatrains and a concluding couplet, with the rhyme scheme being A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, GG. Now we're finally ready to look at some examples, but before we do that, just keep in mind that the rules we just learned are the general rules of sonneteering, and they can be broken, as you'll see in one of the examples that I'm about to provide. With that in mind, generally speaking, the sonnets that you encounter during your English language arts studies will follow these rules. Okay, so with that, let's take a look at a Petrarchan sonnet and a Shakespearean sonnet. For an example of a Petrarchan sonnet, I've chosen this great Henry Wadsworth Longfellow poem, Mezzo. Let's read this poem together, and we'll do so according to the rules of reading poetry according to ELA+. These rules are outlined in our video, How to Read a Poem. If you haven't already watched that video, please do so. If you have watched that video, you know that the first rule of reading poetry is read the poem to yourself. So go ahead and do that right now. Pause this video and read Mezzo to yourself. Okay, welcome back. As some of you may know, the second rule of reading poetry is read the poem out loud. And that's what we're going to do right now. Half of my life is gone, and I have let the years slip from me and have not fulfilled the aspiration of my youth, to build some tower of song with lofty parapet. not indolence, nor pleasure, nor the fret of restless passions that would not be stilled, but sorrow, and a care that almost killed, kept me from what I may accomplish yet. Though, halfway up the hill, I see the past lying beneath me with its sounds and sights. A city in the twilight, dim and vast, with smoking roofs, soft bells, and gleaming lights. And here above me on the autumnal blast, the cataract of death far thundering from the heights. Here we see the general format of the Petrarchan sonnet. Let's take a look at the octave first, the first 8 lines. The rhyme scheme is exactly what you would expect given the rules. A, B, B, A, B, B, A. Let, fulfilled, build, parapet, fret, stilled, killed, yet. But what about the meter? Here we find our first deviation from iambic pentameter. Now, let's ignore that for now. We'll get back to it later. What we want to do here is focus on the octave and understand what the octave in a Petrarchan sonnet is meant to achieve. And what an octave is meant to achieve in a Petrarchan sonnet is introduce a problem for the poem. Can you identify the poet's problem in this octave? If you can't, pause the video again and read it one more time. Think hard about what the problem could be. All right, welcome back. Did you get it? Yeah, this guy's having a midlife crisis. Old Henry is upset. He's getting old and he hasn't accomplished the things yet that he set out to do in his life. This is the problem. This is the octave. Now on to the sestet. In a Petrarchan sonnet, the sestet is meant to provide a resolution to the problem presented in the octave. So go ahead and read this sestet and think about what this resolution could be. The first thing that we notice upon reading this sestet is that this is where the volta occurs. Remember that the volta is a turn, a change in the poem. Think about it. In the octave, Longfellow is mournfully ruminating about his past and his misspent youth. But then we get the volta, we get the turn, we get the change. In the sestet, he's no longer interested in thinking about the past. He's looking forward into the future. This is the change, this is the turn, this is the volta. And this is something very clever about the Petrarchan sonnet. The volta is represented quite clearly not only in a subject matter change, but also in the format of the poem. Look, the rhyme scheme itself changes. In the octave, we have the established rhyme scheme of A, B, B, A, B, B, A, and then the volta, and Longfellow changes it up. He uses the C, D, C, D, C, D rhyme scheme. So the change in subject matter and tone is associated with the change in the rhyme scheme. Now, poetry lends itself to diverse interpretation, especially a poem like Mezzo, Cammin, which ends so ambiguously. Personally, I read this poem very optimistically. You may have a different interpretation, and I'm very interested in hearing what you have to say on this subject, so let me know down in the comments. But my view is this. The poem starts out in the octave with this problem. He hasn't achieved anything in his life, he's feeling down, and he's really not happy at all. But if you look at it closely, what he's doing is he's looking down this hill, and everything is set in stone. He can see it clearly for what it is. Nothing is going to change there. But as he looks up the hill that he's climbing, things aren't so certain. Everything's a little bit more murky. Yes, he can hear the blast of the cataract of death coming, but even that's far in the distance. So I think what Longfellow is getting at here is that he can make the future what he wants because it's not set in stone like his past is. That's my interpretation of Mezzo, Cammin. And again, I'm very interested in your interpretation of this poem, so let me know down in the comments. Now let's take a look at a Shakespearean sonnet. The first thing you're going to notice is that this poem is not written by William Shakespeare, and there's 2 reasons for that. Number 1, on this channel, we are going to read and analyze with great depth every single one of William Shakespeare's sonnets, so there's no reason to get into them now. And number 2, I just really like this poem, and I would like to share it with you all. This poem is the 28th sonnet of the poems of Giles Fletcher the Elder. Remember that the first rule of reading poetry is read the poem to yourself. So go ahead and do that now. Pause this video and read the poem to yourself. Okay then, welcome back. The second rule of reading poetry is read the poem out loud. I'm going to do that for you right now. In time the strong and stately turrets fall. In time the rose and silver lilies die. In time the monarchs captive are in thrall. In time the sea and rivers are made dry. The hardest flint in time doth melt asunder. Still living fame in time doth fade away. The mountains proud we see in time come under, and earth for aye we see in time decay. The sun in time forgets for to retire from out the east, where he was wont to rise. The basest thoughts we see in time aspire, and greedy minds in time do wealth despise. Thus all, sweet fair, in time must have an end, except thy beauty, virtues, and thy friend. Now that we've read the poem, let's look at how it either conforms or does not conform to the format that we've established for a Shakespearean sonnet. Well, the first thing we notice is that it is 14 lines long, and its rhyme scheme is of the Shakespearean sonnet variety. A-B, A-B, C-D, C-D, E-F, E-F, G-G. First quatrain. Fall, die, thrall, dry. Second quatrain. Asunder, away, under, decay. Third quatrain. Retire, rise, aspire, despise. And the concluding couplet, end, friend. It is important to note that in a Shakespearean sonnet, the volta typically does not arrive until the concluding couplet. This affords the author of a Shakespearean sonnet a little bit more time and space to develop the poem's problem. After all, a poet composing a Shakespearean sonnet has 12 full lines to develop his problem, whereas the author of a Petrarchan sonnet has only 8. So go ahead and read the first 3 quatrains of this poem again and ask yourself, what is the problem that the author presents in these 3 quatrains? The problem here is that time eats everything, consuming all in its relentless marching waste. Pretty dire predicament we find ourselves in, isn't it? But then the volta. How does the volta of the concluding couplet change the poem or answer the problem of the preceding 3 quatrains? Well, perhaps all isn't ephemeral and disappearing. Beauty, virtue, and friendship might not be anyway. It's these transcendent qualities, according to the poet, which will endure where all else is just consumed by the all-marching waste of time. Another way to put it is this. Perhaps the material world is subject to doom and entropy, but the realm of ideas and spirituality, beauty, virtue, friendship, these are eternal and untouched by the natural process of decay. All right, that's it. Those are the 2 major formats of the English language sonnet. Which one is your favorite, the Shakespearean sonnet or the Petrarchan sonnet? Let me know down in the comments below. This concludes our video lesson, Introduction to the English Sonnet. I hope you enjoyed it. In this video lesson, we discuss first the history of the sonnet. Then we introduce the 2 major formats of the English language sonnet, the Petrarchan and the Shakespearean, and we follow that up with a reading and analysis of both of those formats. And now, we're ready for some comprehension questions. Number 1. How many lines are in an English sonnet? Number 2. What is a volta? Number 3. What is iambic pentameter? Number 4. Identify the lines in Longfellow's Mezzo that do not conform to iambic pentameter. Discuss why this might be the case that the poet chose to do this. Number 5. What is the difference in format between the Petrarchan sonnet and the Shakespearean sonnet? Number 6. Pick a format, the Petrarchan or the Shakespearean, and write a sonnet down in the comments below. This is going to be interesting. I'm very curious to see what you guys come up with. Alright, that concludes this video lesson for Introduction to the English Sonnet. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something from it. If you did, please subscribe to the channel and like the video. Also consider sharing it with friends, fellow students, and your English teacher. If you have any questions about this video or other questions about your English language arts studies in school, please don't hesitate to ask down in the comments. I'm available, and I'll do my very best to offer high-quality answers to anything you might want to know. In the show notes, you'll find links to the internet sources I cited if you want to explore more. I encourage you to do so. ELA Plus is a free, regularly updated supplemental guide to the English language arts. Subscribe to learn more. Until our next lesson, keep reading, get obsessed, and take care of yourselves and others. Thank you.